What started as cruel entertainment for a power-hungry sergeant would end with him in handcuffs, facing a general whose fury could be heard across 3 states. All because he never bothered to check who he was really messing with. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres had perfected the art of invisibility. At 34, she moved through the crowded barracks of Camp Riverside with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to observe was to become utterly unremarkable. Her auburn hair, when not pulled back in the regulation style, fell in gentle waves that caught the morning light filtering through the narrow windows. But today, like every day for the past 6 weeks, it was secured in a precise bun that revealed nothing of the woman beneath the uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The other recruits at Camp Riverside saw exactly what she wanted them to see. Private Jessica Morgan, 26 years old, college dropout, struggling to keep up with the physical demands of basic training. She had crafted this persona carefully, studying the files of real recruits who had washed out in previous cycles, borrowing their mannerisms, their hesitations, their small rebellions against authority. The backstory was simple but believable. A woman from rural Montana who had joined the Army as a last resort after a series of failed jobs and a relationship gone wrong. What they didn't see was the Rhodes Scholar who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard with degrees in both psychology and international relations. They didn't know about the classified missions in 3 different countries, or the commendations locked away in a secure file at the Pentagon. They certainly had no idea that the woman struggling to complete her morning push-ups had once spent 48 hours in a hostile interrogation room without breaking cover, earning her the respect of intelligence officers twice her age. Camp Riverside itself was a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and dusty training fields nestled in the Nevada desert, about 2 hours outside of Las Vegas. Officially, it was designated as a standard basic training facility for new Army recruits. Unofficially, it had become the subject of increasingly disturbing reports that had reached the highest levels of military command. Allegations of systematic hazing, financial exploitation of recruits, and abuse of authority had been filtering up through official channels for months, but internal investigations had yielded nothing concrete. The commanding officers were either genuinely unaware of the problems or had become skilled at hiding them. That's where Rebecca came in. Military intelligence had needed someone who could blend in completely, someone whose presence wouldn't raise any red flags among the staff or recruits. Her superiors had handpicked her for this particular assignment because of her unique ability to disappear into any role, combined with her proven track record of exposing corruption within military ranks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as recruits filed out for their daily formation. Rebecca fell into line with the others, her movements deliberately a half-second slower than they should be, her posture just slightly less rigid than regulation demanded. These small details were crucial to maintaining her cover. Any drill sergeant worth his salt would immediately spot someone with advanced military training trying to pretend otherwise. Sergeant First Class Danny Kruger stood before the assembled recruits like a predator surveying prey. At 38, he had the build of a man who had been strong once but was beginning to soften around the edges, though he still carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His pale blue eyes held a particular kind of cruelty that Rebecca had encountered before in men who had been given power over others without the character to handle it responsibly. Kruger had been her primary target from the moment she arrived at Camp Riverside. Her preliminary research had identified him as the center of most complaints, though no formal charges had ever been filed. Previous recruits had reported everything from forced labor in his personal garden to arbitrary punishments that bordered on torture. But fear of retaliation had kept most victims silent, and those who did speak up often found their military careers mysteriously derailed. "Listen up, losers," Kruger's voice carried across the formation with practiced authority. "Today we're going to separate the real soldiers from the wannabes. Some of you have been coasting through my program, thinking you can just slide by with minimum effort." His gaze swept across the ranks, pausing momentarily on several recruits before settling on Rebecca with obvious satisfaction. She had been building to this moment for weeks, carefully positioning herself as the perfect target for Kruger's particular brand of abuse. She was older than most recruits, which he seemed to resent. She appeared to struggle with some of the physical requirements which fed his ego. Most importantly, she had no apparent connections or advocates within the system, exactly the kind of person that bullies preferred to target. What Kruger didn't know was that every interaction they'd had was being carefully documented in Rebecca's memory, ready to be transcribed in precise detail for the report that would eventually land on a general's desk. He didn't know that the seemingly random questions she asked about base procedures were actually intelligence gathering. And he certainly didn't suspect that the quiet woman who flinched when he raised his voice had faced down hardened criminals and international terrorists without blinking. As the morning formation continued, Rebecca allowed herself a small smile that no one else could see. The investigation was proceeding exactly as planned, and soon Sergeant Kruger would discover that some people were far more dangerous than they appeared, especially when they were patient enough to let their enemies hang themselves with their own rope. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything at Camp Riverside, though only one person in the formation understood just how dramatically the balance of power was about to shift. The trouble began on a sweltering Tuesday morning during Week 4 of basic training, when the Nevada sun turned Camp Riverside into a furnace and tempers ran as hot as the desert air. Sergeant Kruger had been circling Rebecca like a vulture for days, looking for the perfect opportunity to make an example of someone, and the oppressive heat seemed to sharpen his predatory instincts. It started with something trivial it always did with men like Kruger. During morning inspection, he claimed that Rebecca's boots weren't polished to standard, though they gleamed just as brightly as everyone else's. In the suffocating heat of the barracks, with sweat already beading on every recruit's forehead despite the early hour, Kruger made his move. "Morgan!" His voice cracked like a whip across the silent formation. "Front and center now." Rebecca stepped forward with practiced hesitation, allowing just the right amount of nervousness to creep into her posture. Inside, she was calculating, documenting, preparing for whatever came next. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the first real escalation that would give her concrete evidence of Kruger's abuse of authority. "Look at these pathetic excuses for military footwear," Kruger announced to the assembled recruits, pointing at Rebecca's perfectly regulation boots. "This is what happens when civilians think they can just show up and play soldier without putting in the work." The other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Even they could see that Rebecca's boots met every standard, but none of them dared to speak up. Fear was Kruger's most effective weapon, and he wielded it with the skill of years of practice. Private Amanda Foster, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had quickly become Rebecca's unofficial bunkmate, cast worried glances between Rebecca and Kruger. Next to her stood Private Michael Rodriguez, a soft-spoken young man from Texas whose hands were already clenched into fists at his sides. They had both witnessed Kruger's escalating harassment over the past weeks and sensed that something bigger was building. "Since you clearly don't understand military standards, Morgan," Kruger continued, his voice dripping with false concern, "you're going to spend the rest of the day helping our kitchen staff understand them too. After your regular training, of course." Extra kitchen duty was a classic punishment, technically within regulations but designed to exhaust and humiliate. Rebecca had expected something like this, but she also knew it was just the beginning. Men like Kruger always tested boundaries before crossing them completely. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, keeping her voice neutral and avoiding eye contact as she had been trained to do. But she could feel Kruger studying her reaction, looking for signs of resentment or rebellion that he could use to justify further escalation. Over the next few days, the pattern intensified. Rebecca found herself assigned to increasingly unpleasant duties that kept her busy from dawn until well past lights out. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, sorted equipment that was already organized, and performed pointless tasks that served no purpose other than to break her spirit. The other recruits watched with growing unease. Foster tried to help when she could, sharing her rations when Rebecca missed meals due to extended duty assignments. Rodriguez began documenting what he witnessed, keeping careful notes in a small journal he hid in his footlocker. Even recruits who barely knew Rebecca began to recognize that what was happening to her was wrong. But Kruger was just getting started. He had identified Rebecca as his primary target, and he intended to use her as an object lesson for the entire company. The fact that she endured his harassment without complaint only seemed to fuel his determination to find her breaking point. The psychological pressure was carefully calculated. Kruger would praise other recruits for accomplishments identical to Rebecca's, while criticizing her for the same actions. He would assign her to tasks that were impossible to complete in the given time frame, then punish her for failure. He made sure that her name was always first on every unpleasant duty roster and last for any privileges or recognition. What Kruger didn't realize was that every action was being carefully cataloged by someone with years of experience in recognizing and documenting abuse patterns. Rebecca had seen similar tactics used by hostile forces during interrogations, and she understood exactly how the psychological manipulation was designed to work. The only difference was that instead of being a victim, she was a scientist studying a particularly toxic specimen. The breaking point came during a particularly grueling afternoon training session. The temperature had soared past 110 degrees, and the recruits were pushed through a punishing obstacle course that left even the strongest among them gasping for breath. When Rebecca finished the course only seconds behind the fastest time, Kruger found fault with her technique and ordered her to repeat it. "Maybe the third time will teach you how real soldiers move, Morgan," he announced to the gathered recruits, who watched with increasing discomfort as their fellow trainee was forced to tackle the obstacles again and again while they rested in whatever shade they could find. By the time Kruger finally called a halt, Rebecca was on her fifth run through the course and visibly struggling. But it wasn't the physical exhaustion that caught the attention of her fellow recruits. It was the look in her eyes. Where there had been resignation before, there was now something harder, more determined. Something that suggested the quiet woman they thought they knew might be far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. As the recruits filed back toward the barracks, Foster fell into step beside Rebecca. "Are you okay?" she whispered, glancing around to make sure Kruger wasn't watching. Rebecca nodded, but her response carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine, but Sergeant Kruger is about to learn that some people aren't as helpless as they appear." It was a quiet statement, delivered without drama or theatrics. But something in Rebecca's tone made Foster shiver despite the desert heat, and she found herself wondering exactly who her bunkmate really was. The harassment evolved into a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare over the following week. Kruger had tasted blood, and like any predator, he was emboldened by his apparent success. What he interpreted as submission from Rebecca was actually the patient gathering of evidence, but his ego prevented him from recognizing the difference between defeat and strategic endurance. The escalation began with sleep deprivation. Kruger started scheduling Rebecca for guard duty during hours when she should have been resting, then criticizing her performance during the day when fatigue inevitably affected her responses. The first night, he assigned her to a 2-hour shift starting at 2 a.m. The second night, it was midnight to 4 a.m. By the third night, she was pulling 6-hour shifts that left her with barely enough time for the minimum sleep required to function. Foster and Rodriguez watched helplessly as their friend's condition deteriorated. Dark circles appeared under Rebecca's eyes, and her usually precise movements became slightly sluggish. During morning formation, she swayed almost imperceptibly on her feet, though she never complained or showed any outward sign of the toll the harassment was taking. "This isn't right," Rodriguez whispered to Foster as they watched Rebecca struggle through morning calisthenics after another nearly sleepless night. "Someone needs to report this to the company commander." Foster shook her head grimly. "And say what? That Kruger is giving extra duties to recruits? Technically, everything he's doing is within his authority. Who's going to believe it's harassment?" She was right, and they both knew it. Kruger was too experienced to cross obvious lines that would trigger automatic investigations. Instead, he operated in the gray areas of military authority, where individual actions might seem reasonable but the cumulative effect was systematically destructive. The psychological pressure intensified when Kruger began involving other recruits in Rebecca's punishment. During one particularly brutal afternoon, he ordered Private James Wilson, a quiet young man from Oregon, to inspect Rebecca's bunk for cleanliness violations. "Wilson, get over here and show Morgan how a real military inspection is conducted," Kruger commanded, his voice carrying across the barracks with theatrical authority. Since she obviously doesn't understand standards, maybe peer instruction will help. Wilson approached Rebecca's bunk with obvious reluctance. Her area was immaculate. Sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter, personal items arranged with geometric precision, boots positioned at exact regulation angles. There was literally nothing to criticize, but Kruger's expectant stare made it clear that Wilson was supposed to find something wrong. Everything looks good to me, Sergeant," Wilson stammered, glancing nervously between Rebecca's perfect bunk and Kruger's increasingly hostile expression. "Look harder, Wilson. Are you telling me that a recruit who's been struggling with basic military standards suddenly achieved perfection overnight?" The other recruits watched in uncomfortable silence as Wilson was forced to nitpick imaginary violations. He eventually pointed to a microscopic piece of lint on Rebecca's pillow, his face burning with shame as he did so. "Outstanding detective work, Wilson," Kruger said with mock enthusiasm. "Morgan, since you clearly need additional instruction in proper housekeeping, you'll be responsible for cleaning the entire barracks tonight after evening formation." This pattern continued for days, with different recruits forced to participate in finding fault with Rebecca's performance. Kruger was systematically corrupting the unit's cohesion, turning recruit against recruit and making everyone complicit in the harassment whether they wanted to be or not. Private Foster finally reached her breaking point during a weapons cleaning session. Rebecca had been assigned to clean not just her own rifle, but 3 additional weapons that Kruger claimed had been improperly maintained by other recruits. As she worked methodically through the tedious process, Kruger provided a running commentary designed to humiliate her in front of the group. "Look at that pathetic technique," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Morgan there is proving that some people just don't have what it takes to be real soldiers. Maybe we should find her a nice desk job somewhere where she can't endanger actual warriors." Foster's hands clenched around her own weapon as she watched Rebecca endure the verbal abuse without response. The quiet dignity with which her friend absorbed each insult was somehow more infuriating than if she had fought back. But it was Rodriguez who noticed something that the others missed. While Rebecca's outward demeanor remained passive, her eyes had changed. There was an intelligence there, a calculating quality that seemed oddly familiar to him, though he couldn't place why. It reminded him of something he had seen in documentaries about military officers, a look of strategic thinking that went far beyond what he would expect from a struggling recruit. The breaking point finally came during a field exercise designed to test the recruit's ability to work under pressure. Kruger had arranged for Rebecca to be paired with Private Thompson, a larger recruit who had been struggling academically and was eager to please the sergeant by any means necessary. The exercise involved carrying heavy equipment across a measured distance within a specified time frame. Thompson, following what he believed were Kruger's unspoken expectations, began accidentally hampering Rebecca's efforts. He would stumble at crucial moments, causing her to lose balance and drop equipment. He would take circuitous routes that wasted precious time and energy. What should have been a routine training exercise became an elaborate setup for public failure. As Rebecca struggled to complete the course while effectively carrying both her own equipment and compensating for Thompson's deliberate interference, Kruger maintained a steady stream of criticism that grew louder and more personal with each passing minute. "This is what happens when we lower our standards," he announced to the gathered recruits. "Some people just don't belong in the army, no matter how much we try to help them." The other recruits watched with growing unease as the exercise continued far longer than necessary. Even Thompson began to look uncomfortable as he realized he was being used as a tool for something that had moved beyond legitimate training into pure cruelty. But Rebecca endured it all, documenting every word, every action, every witness present. In her mind, she was building an airtight case that would eventually destroy not just Kruger's career, but the entire culture of abuse that had taken root at Camp Riverside. As the exercise finally ended and the recruits were dismissed, Foster approached Rebecca with obvious concern. "How are you holding up? I know this has been. I'm exactly where I need to be," Rebecca replied quietly, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to come from some hidden reservoir of strength. And Sergeant Kruger is about to learn that some battles are won not by fighting back immediately, but by choosing the right moment to strike. The certainty in her voice was unsettling, and Foster found herself wondering what her friend wasn't telling them about herself. The moment Sergeant Kruger had been building toward arrived on a scorching Friday afternoon, when the desert heat shimmered off the parade ground like visible rage, and every recruit's uniform was soaked with sweat before they had even begun their training exercises. The atmosphere was electric with tension, as if the very air knew that something decisive was about to happen. Kruger had spent the morning in an unusually foul mood, snapping at recruits for minor infractions and assigning punishments with the arbitrary cruelty of a medieval tyrant. His eyes kept returning to Rebecca throughout the morning formation, and the predatory gleam in them suggested he had something special planned for her. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. The recruits had been standing in formation for nearly an hour in the blazing sun, presenting their gear for Kruger's examination. One by one, he moved down the line, finding fault with nearly everyone but reserving his harshest criticism for Rebecca. When he reached her position, Kruger stopped and studied her equipment with exaggerated intensity. Her rifle was spotless, her gear arranged with textbook precision, her uniform immaculate despite the oppressive heat. For a moment, it seemed he might be forced to move on without finding anything to criticize. Then his eyes fell on her hair. Military regulations required that female recruits keep their hair either cut short or secured in a style that didn't extend below the collar when let down. Rebecca's auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, neat and professional, exactly as it had been every day since her arrival at Camp Riverside. But Kruger had found his opening. "Morgan," he said, his voice carrying across the formation with theatrical authority. "Step forward." Rebecca moved out of formation, her expression neutral, though every recruit could sense the electricity in the air. This felt different from the previous harassment. More focused, more dangerous. "Your hair is out of regulation," Kruger announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Several recruits exchanged confused glances. Rebecca's hair was obviously within standards, pulled back exactly as required. But they had learned not to question Kruger's pronouncements, no matter how arbitrary they seemed. "Sergeant, my hair meets regulation standards," Rebecca replied calmly, her voice steady despite the obvious trap being set for her. Kruger's smile was predatory. "Are you questioning my assessment, recruit?" "No, Sergeant. I'm stating a fact." The defiance was subtle but unmistakable, and it sent a ripple of tension through the assembled formation. No one spoke to Kruger that way, not if they wanted to survive basic training with their dignity intact. "Facts." Kruger's voice rose to a shout. "I'll tell you what's a fact, Morgan. The fact is that you've been walking around this base for weeks thinking you're better than everyone else. The fact is that you've shown nothing but disrespect for military authority since the day you arrived. And the fact is that I've had enough of your attitude." He began circling Rebecca like a predator studying wounded prey, his voice growing louder and more theatrical with each word. The other recruits watched in horrified fascination, recognizing that they were witnessing something that had moved far beyond normal military discipline. "You want to know what I think?" Kruger continued, his face flushing red with manufactured rage. "I think you need a lesson in military bearing that you'll never forget. I think you need to understand what it really means to be a soldier." He gestured to two of the larger recruits, Private Barnes and Private Davis, both of whom had been struggling in their training and were eager to gain Kruger's approval through any means necessary. "Barnes, Davis, grab her arms," Kruger commanded. The two recruits hesitated, looking uncomfortable. Even they could sense that whatever was about to happen had crossed a line from legitimate punishment into something darker. "I said grab her arms." Kruger's voice cracked like a whip. Reluctantly, Barnes and Davis moved forward and took hold of Rebecca's arms. She didn't resist, but something in her eyes had changed. Where there had been careful submission before, there was now a cold fury that made several recruits take an unconscious step backward. "What's happening here, Sergeant?" Rebecca asked, her voice deadly calm. "What's happening?" Kruger said, reaching into his equipment bag and pulling out a pair of electric hair clippers. "Is that you're getting a real military haircut. We're going to solve your regulation problems permanently." The assembled recruits gasped. While head shaving was sometimes used as punishment in extreme cases, it was supposed to be administered through proper channels with documentation and justification. This was clearly an arbitrary act of personal revenge. "Sergeant, this is not authorized punishment," Rebecca said, her voice carrying an edge of authority that several recruits found oddly familiar. "I decide what's authorized on my training ground," Kruger snapped. "Maybe losing that precious hair of yours will teach you some humility." The clippers buzzed to life, their mechanical whine cutting through the desert air like a saw. Kruger grabbed a handful of Rebecca's auburn hair, the same hair she had worn with quiet pride throughout her weeks at Camp Riverside. "Hold her still," he commanded Barnes and Davis as he brought the clippers toward her scalp. The first chunk of hair fell to the ground, and with it, something fundamental changed in the dynamic of the formation. Several recruits looked away, unable to watch the deliberate humiliation of someone who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Others watched in horrified fascination as their drill sergeant crossed lines that even they knew shouldn't be crossed. Rebecca herself remained remarkably composed, though her jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like steel cables. She stared straight ahead as more hair fell around her feet, each cut deliberate and rough, designed for maximum psychological impact rather than any practical purpose. "Look at that," Kruger taunted as he continued his work. "Not so proud now, are you, Morgan? This is what happens when you forget your place." But if he was expecting tears or pleas for mercy, he was disappointed. Rebecca endured the humiliation with a dignity that only seemed to infuriate him further. The harder she remained composed, the more aggressive his cuts became, leaving uneven patches and completely bald spots that would take months to grow back properly. Foster watched with tears streaming down her face, while Rodriguez clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Even recruits who barely knew Rebecca were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When Kruger finally switched off the clippers, Rebecca's head was a patchwork of stubble and bare scalp. She looked nothing like the woman who had stood in formation just minutes before, but something in her eyes burned brighter than ever. "There," Kruger said with satisfaction. "Now you look like a real soldier." Rebecca said nothing, but when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that sent chills through everyone present. "You're going to regret this, Sergeant." The confidence in her voice was absolute, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Kruger felt a flicker of unease. The aftermath of the public humiliation settled over Camp Riverside like a toxic cloud. As the recruits were dismissed from formation, they moved in stunned silence, casting furtive glances at Rebecca as she walked toward the barracks with her head held high despite her drastically altered appearance. The patches of stubble and bare scalp caught the harsh afternoon sunlight, creating a stark reminder of what they had all witnessed. Foster and Rodriguez flanked Rebecca as she entered the barracks, their presence a silent show of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by the other recruits. The normal chatter and activity that usually filled the building was replaced by an oppressive quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry," Foster whispered as they reached Rebecca's bunk. "That was completely out of line. Someone needs to report this." Rebecca sat on the edge of her bunk and ran a hand over her ruined scalp, feeling the uneven patches where Kruger's rough cutting had left its mark. When she looked up at her concerned friends, there was something different in her expression. A cold calculation that neither of them had seen before. "Report it to whom?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Kruger's immediate superior is Captain Walsh, who's been conveniently absent during every incident of harassment over the past month. The company commander hasn't set foot on the training ground in weeks. And the base commander thinks everything here runs like clockwork because that's what his reports tell him." Rodriguez frowned at the analytical way she laid out the command structure, noting details that most recruits wouldn't think to observe. "You've been paying attention to things," he said carefully. "I always pay attention," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying an edge that made both of her friends take notice. "And right now, I'm paying attention to the fact that Sergeant Kruger just made the biggest mistake of his career." As evening approached and the barracks settled into the quiet routine of personal maintenance time, Rebecca waited. She listened to the conversations around her, noting which recruits were disturbed by what they had witnessed and which seemed indifferent or even approving. She catalogued the names of those who had shown sympathy and those who had looked away when she needed support. But most importantly, she waited for the right moment to make a phone call that would change everything. The opportunity came during the evening meal. As the recruits filed into the mess hall, Rebecca quietly excused herself, claiming she needed to use the facilities. Instead, she made her way to the bank of pay phones near the administrative building, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The number she dialed was one she had memorized months ago but hoped never to use except in the most extreme circumstances. It was answered on the second ring by a crisp, professional voice that cut through the static like a blade. General Patricia Hawthorne's office, Colonel Myers speaking. Sir, this is Lieutenant Colonel Torres. I need to report a critical incident that requires immediate attention. There was a pause, followed by the sound of papers being shuffled. Torres? What are you doing calling this line? You're supposed to be maintaining operational security. Rebecca's voice remained steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. My operational security has been compromised, sir. I've been subjected to unauthorized punishment by my training instructor, including physical assault and public humiliation. The incident was witnessed by approximately 30 personnel. Another pause, longer this time. Explain exactly what happened, and be precise. Rebecca gave a detailed account of the afternoon's events, describing Kruger's behavior, the forced haircutting, the witnesses present, and the complete breakdown of military discipline and procedure. She spoke in the clipped, professional tone of an intelligence officer delivering a mission report, though her personal anger was evident to anyone who knew how to listen. This is extremely serious, Colonel Myers said when she finished. Not just because of what happened to you personally, but because it indicates a complete breakdown of command structure at Camp Riverside. We've been receiving reports about problems there, but nothing this blatant. What are my orders, sir? Continue your mission for now, but document everything. General Hawthorne is going to want a complete report on this incident and anything else you've observed. And Torres, I'm sorry this happened. What that sergeant did was completely unacceptable. Understood, sir. But I want it on record that when this investigation concludes, I want to be the one to read the charges against Sergeant Kruger. After ending the call, Rebecca remained by the phone for several minutes, staring out at the desert landscape that surrounded Camp Riverside. In her mind, she was no longer Private Jessica Morgan, the struggling recruit who had endured weeks of harassment. She was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, a decorated intelligence officer with the authority to destroy careers and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. When she returned to the mess hall, several recruits noticed that something about her had changed. She moved with a different kind of confidence now, as if a mask had been partially removed to reveal someone far more dangerous underneath. Rodriguez was the first to approach her as she sat down with her meal tray. "Where did you go?" he asked quietly. "I made a phone call," Rebecca replied simply. "To whom?" Rebecca's smile was cold and predatory. "To someone who's very interested in what happened here today." Foster leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Rebecca, who are you really? And don't tell me you're just some college dropout from Montana. I've been watching you for weeks, and nothing about you adds up." Rebecca considered her response carefully. The mission was entering its final phase, and soon her true identity would be revealed anyway. But for now, she needed to maintain enough of her cover to avoid premature exposure. "Let's just say that Sergeant Kruger picked the wrong person to mess with," she said quietly. "And by tomorrow, everyone at Camp Riverside is going to understand exactly how wrong he was." As word of Rebecca's cryptic responses spread through the recruit population, a sense of anticipation began building throughout the barracks. Something was coming, something that would fundamentally change the dynamics at Camp Riverside. The only question was when it would arrive and how dramatic the consequences would be. That night, as Rebecca lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she touched her ruined scalp one more time and smiled grimly. Kruger had wanted to humiliate her, to break her spirit and use her as an example for the other recruits. Instead, He had just provided her with the evidence she needed to bring down not just himself, but the entire corrupt system that had allowed his behavior to flourish unchecked. The wheels of military justice were already turning, and by morning, Camp Riverside would begin experiencing changes that would echo all the way to Washington. The revelation that would recontextualize everything the recruits thought they knew about their fellow trainee began in the pre-dawn darkness of Saturday morning, though none of them realized it at the time. While Camp Riverside slept, a series of encrypted communications were racing between secure military networks, carrying information that would soon transform a remote Nevada training facility into the center of a storm that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Rebecca Torres, though the recruits still knew her only as Private Jessica Morgan, had not been entirely truthful during her phone call with Colonel Myers. The mission that had brought her to Camp Riverside was far more complex and significant than a simple investigation into training irregularities. She was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, one of the Army's most accomplished intelligence officers, with a service record that read like a thriller novel and security clearances that gave her access to some of the military's most sensitive operations. Her assignment to Camp Riverside had begun 6 months earlier when a pattern of disturbing reports had reached the desk of General Patricia Hawthorne, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. What had initially appeared to be isolated incidents of poor leadership had gradually revealed themselves as symptoms of something much more serious. A systematic breakdown in military discipline that threatened to undermine the integrity of the entire training system. The reports had been subtle at first. Recruits washing out at unusually high rates. Complaints about training methods that seemed to focus more on humiliation than education. Financial irregularities involving recruit personal funds. Equipment that somehow went missing from secure storage areas. Taken individually, these incidents could be explained as the normal challenges of running a large military installation. Taken together, they painted a picture of institutional corruption that demanded immediate investigation. But previous investigations had failed to penetrate the wall of silence that surrounded Camp Riverside. Traditional military inspectors were too easily spotted and too formal in their approach to uncover the kind of subtle abuse that thrived in the shadows of official procedure. What was needed was someone who could blend in completely, someone whose presence would raise no suspicions while they documented the reality of what was happening to America's newest soldiers. Rebecca had been the obvious choice for such an assignment. Her psychological profile indicated an unusual ability to subsume her real identity into assumed roles, a skill that had served her well during undercover operations in 3 different countries. Her military record included commendations for successful penetration of hostile organizations, and she had demonstrated an exceptional talent for gathering intelligence while maintaining perfect operational security. The transformation from Lieutenant Colonel Torres to Private Morgan had taken months of preparation. Every detail of her cover identity had been meticulously crafted, from her fabricated personal history to the carefully rehearsed mannerisms that would make her seem like a genuine struggling recruit. She had studied videos of actual basic training failures, interviewed former recruits who had washed out of similar programs, and practiced until she could convincingly portray someone who was overwhelmed by military life. What made her performance particularly convincing was her decision to actually struggle with certain aspects of training. She deliberately performed below her capabilities during physical fitness tests, showed confusion about procedures she could have recited in her sleep, and displayed the kind of hesitation and uncertainty that drill sergeants expected from civilian recruits adapting to military structure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But maintaining such a comprehensive deception required constant vigilance. Every conversation had to be filtered through the persona of Jessica Morgan. Every reaction had to be calibrated to seem authentic. Every moment of the day required her to suppress the natural confidence and authority that came from years of leadership experience. The psychological toll of the assignment had been heavier than expected. Watching genuinely vulnerable young recruits suffer under Kruger's arbitrary cruelty while being unable to intervene had tested her resolve in ways that combat operations never had. During her previous missions, she had been working against clearly defined enemies in hostile territory. At Camp Riverside, she was forced to watch abuse being inflicted on her own people by someone wearing the same uniform she had sworn to honor. The decision to let Kruger's harassment escalate to the point of physical assault had been the most difficult choice of her career. She could have ended the investigation at any point by revealing her true identity, but doing so would have exposed only the surface level of corruption while allowing the deeper problems to continue festering. Every humiliation she endured, every arbitrary punishment she accepted, every moment of manufactured helplessness was building toward a comprehensive case that would clean house not just at Camp Riverside, but throughout the entire training system. Her superiors had been explicit about the scope of her mission. General Hawthorne suspected that the problems at Camp Riverside were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of abuse that might extend to other installations. Rebecca's assignment was not just to document what was happening at one facility, but to develop a complete understanding of how such corruption could take root and flourish within the military's training infrastructure. The phone call she had made after Kruger's assault had set in motion a carefully planned sequence of events that would unfold over the next 48 hours. General Hawthorne had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence, something so blatant and well-documented that it could not be dismissed or covered up by local commanders who might be complicit in the problems. But Rebecca knew that her personal ordeal was far from over. The most dangerous part of any undercover operation was the transition from investigation to revelation. Too early and important evidence might be lost. Too late, and the safety of both herself and the genuine recruits could be compromised. As she lay in her bunk that night, running her fingers over the patches of stubble where her hair had been roughly cut away, Rebecca was already planning the next phase of her mission. Tomorrow would bring new developments that would test both her ability to maintain her cover and her strength to see the investigation through to its conclusion. The recruits sleeping around her had no idea that the woman they thought of as a victim was actually the most dangerous person on the entire base. Someone with the authority and determination to bring down everyone who had participated in the systematic abuse of military authority. By Monday morning, everything at Camp Riverside would begin to change in ways that none of them could imagine. The first signs that something significant was about to happen at Camp Riverside appeared at dawn on Monday morning, though most of the recruits were too focused on their own exhaustion to notice the subtle changes in the base's routine. Rebecca, however, had been trained to recognize the telltale indicators of an incoming operation, and she spotted them immediately. It began with the vehicles. During her morning run, a solo exercise that Kruger had assigned as additional punishment for her attitude problems, Rebecca noticed 3 black sedans with government plates parked in spaces that were usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The vehicles were positioned with tactical precision, angled for quick departure and positioned to provide clear sight lines to multiple exit routes. To casual observers, they might have seemed like routine administrative visits, but Rebecca recognized the hallmarks of a coordinated official response. More telling was the behavior of the base's senior staff. Captain Walsh, who had been conspicuously absent during most of Kruger's harassment campaigns, suddenly appeared on the training ground for the first time in weeks. His presence was nervous and agitated, constantly checking his radio and glancing toward the administrative building with obvious anxiety. Master Sergeant Cole, the senior non-commissioned officer who normally handled recruit discipline with professional detachment, was moving through his duties with the rigid precision of someone operating under intense scrutiny. But the most significant indicator was Kruger himself. The man who had spent weeks projecting absolute confidence and authority now carried himself with the barely contained panic of someone who sensed that his world was about to collapse. His usual theatrical cruelty had been replaced by an almost manic attention to proper procedure, as if he was trying to retroactively establish a pattern of professional behavior that could counter whatever accusations might be coming. During morning formation, Kruger's voice lacked its usual vicious edge. He issued orders with mechanical efficiency but avoided the personal attacks and arbitrary punishments that had characterized his previous interactions with the recruits. Most significantly, he barely looked at Rebecca, as if acknowledging her presence might somehow accelerate whatever reckoning was approaching. The recruits noticed the change immediately. Foster whispered to Rodriguez during equipment inspection that something was definitely wrong with their drill sergeant. "He's acting like he's scared of something," she observed, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Did you see those official cars in the command parking area? And Captain Walsh has been checking on us every 20 minutes. When was the last time he showed that much interest in our training? Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Harris, a young officer who normally handled administrative duties but rarely appeared on the training ground. His presence was particularly unusual because he was carrying a clipboard with what appeared to be official documentation, and his manner suggested he was there on specific orders rather than routine business. "Sergeant Kruger," Lieutenant Harris called out in a voice that carried more authority than his junior rank would normally command. "Report to the command post immediately for administrative review." The formal language sent a ripple of tension through the formation. Administrative review was military speak for the kind of official scrutiny that could end careers, and everyone present understood the implications. Kruger's face went pale, but he maintained enough composure to acknowledge the order professionally. "Yes, sir. Recruits, continue with equipment maintenance under Corporal Martinez's supervision." As Kruger hurried toward the administrative building, his usual swagger replaced by the uncertain stride of a man walking toward his own execution, the recruits exchanged meaningful glances. Something big was definitely happening, and it seemed to center around the events of the previous Friday afternoon. Corporal Martinez, a professional soldier who had always maintained strict neutrality regarding Kruger's methods, took charge of the formation with obvious relief. His approach to training was methodical and respectful, treating the recruits as developing soldiers rather than targets for personal abuse. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone present. "All right, people," Martinez announced to the group. "We're going to continue with weapons maintenance, but we're going to do it by the book. Anyone who has questions about proper procedure, ask them. Anyone who needs additional instruction, request it. We're here to turn you into competent soldiers, not to play games." The professionalism in his voice was like cool water after weeks of psychological torture, and several recruits visibly relaxed for the first time since arriving at Camp Riverside. But Rebecca remained alert, recognizing that the most critical phases of her mission were just beginning. 20 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. Kruger did not return from his administrative review, and his continued absence began to generate increasingly wild speculation among the recruits. Some theorized that he was being reassigned. Others wondered if he was facing disciplinary action for his treatment of Rebecca. A few optimistic souls even suggested that he might be getting promoted and transferred to a different command. The truth became clearer when Lieutenant Harris returned to the training ground, this time accompanied by Major Jennifer Park, the base's Inspector General. Major Park's presence was significant because she was responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and abuse within the command structure. Her appearance at the training site suggested that something far more serious than routine administrative business was taking place. "Attention," Corporal Martinez called out, bringing the recruits to rigid posture as the two officers approached. Major Park surveyed the formation with the experienced eye of someone who had seen every variety of military dysfunction during her career. When her gaze settled on Rebecca, something passed between them. A moment of recognition that was too brief for the other recruits to notice, but spoke volumes about the real nature of what was happening. "I am Major Park, Inspector General for this installation," she announced to the assembled recruits. "Over the next several hours, my staff will be conducting individual interviews with all personnel assigned to this training company. These interviews are part of an official investigation into allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority." The formal announcement sent shockwaves through the formation. While some recruits had suspected that Rebecca's treatment might trigger some kind of official response, none of them had anticipated an investigation of this scope and formality. During these interviews, Major Park continued, "You will be asked to provide detailed accounts of your experiences during basic training. You are required to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Any attempt to mislead investigators or to intimidate witnesses will result in serious disciplinary action." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the statement that would transform the entire dynamic at Camp Riverside. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. Every person in this formation has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of rank or position. Unauthorized punishment, harassment, and abuse of authority are serious crimes under military law, and they will be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. As the recruits were dismissed to prepare for their individual interviews, Rebecca allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The wheels of military justice were finally turning, and by the end of the day, everyone at Camp Riverside would understand that some lines should never be crossed, especially when the person being targeted had the power to bring down an entire corrupt system. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, and Rebecca was ready to see it through to its conclusion. The formal investigation machinery descended upon Camp Riverside with the methodical precision of a military operation, transforming the training facility from a remote desert outpost into the epicenter of what would become one of the most comprehensive corruption cases in recent Army history. By noon on Monday, the administrative building had been converted into an investigative command center, with temporary offices established in every available conference room and interview station. The scope of the investigation became apparent as additional personnel arrived throughout the morning. Military police investigators, criminal investigation division agents, and administrative law specialists created a steady stream of official vehicles entering the base. Each new arrival carried briefcases, recording equipment, and the unmistakable air of federal authority that made even the most confident base personnel nervous. Foster and Rodriguez found themselves among the first recruits called for interviews, a selection that seemed random but which Rebecca recognized as strategically planned. The investigators were clearly following a specific protocol designed to gather testimony from key witnesses before word could spread about the scope and seriousness of the inquiry. Foster emerged from her interview session visibly shaken, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly, as she rejoined the group of recruits waiting in the administrative building's main corridor. When Rodriguez approached her with obvious concern, she could only shake her head and whisper, "They know everything. They have details about things I didn't even realize I had noticed." Rodriguez's own interview lasted nearly 2 hours, during which he was questioned not only about his observations of Kruger's behavior but also about the broader culture of fear and intimidation that had characterized their training experience. The investigators were particularly interested in patterns of behavior, documentation of incidents, and the response, or lack thereof, from supervisory personnel. "They asked me about things that happened weeks ago," Rodriguez confided to Foster after his session concluded. "Specific conversations, exact dates, names of witnesses. This isn't some routine investigation, they're building a criminal case." As the day progressed, word spread through the recruit population that the investigation extended far beyond the immediate incident involving Rebecca's forced haircut. Investigators were asking detailed questions about financial irregularities, equipment theft, unauthorized use of recruit labor, and a pattern of systematic abuse that appeared to involve multiple staff members across different levels of the command structure. The most significant development came when Master Sergeant Cole was escorted from the training ground by military police personnel, his departure witnessed by dozens of recruits who had previously believed him to be beyond accountability. Cole's removal sent shockwaves through the base's power structure, as he had been Kruger's immediate supervisor and was responsible for oversight of all training activities. Captain Walsh, who had spent the morning in increasingly frantic conferences with investigators, was observed leaving the base entirely in the early afternoon, his personal vehicle loaded with boxes that suggested a permanent departure rather than a temporary absence. His exit was accompanied by 2 official vehicles, leading to widespread speculation about whether he was fleeing prosecution or being relocated for his own protection. But the most dramatic moment of the investigation came when Sergeant Kruger himself was brought back to the training area under military police escort. The man who had terrorized recruits with arbitrary authority for months now walked with the shuffling gait of someone whose world had completely collapsed. His uniform, usually immaculate, was wrinkled and disheveled, and his face carried the hollow expression of someone confronting the full consequences of their actions. The recruits watched in stunned silence as Kruger was marched past their formation toward a waiting vehicle. Some felt satisfaction at seeing their tormentor brought low. Others experienced a complex mixture of vindication and unease, realizing that they were witnessing the destruction of a man's career and possibly his freedom. Private Wilson, who had been forced to participate in Rebecca's humiliation by finding imaginary violations in her bunk area, approached her during the afternoon break with obvious distress. "I want to apologize," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew what he was making me do was wrong, but I was scared to refuse." I should have stood up for you. Rebecca's response surprised him with its gentleness. You were put in an impossible situation, Wilson. Kruger used fear to make everyone complicit in his abuse. That's on him, not on you. Her understanding only seemed to increase Wilson's distress. But you never broke. Even when he was cutting your hair, even when everyone was watching, you never gave him the satisfaction of seeing you cry. How did you stay so strong? The question drew the attention of several other recruits who had been wondering the same thing. Rebecca considered her response carefully, knowing that her answer might reveal more about her true nature than was safe at this stage of the investigation. Sometimes strength isn't about fighting back immediately, she said finally. Sometimes it's about enduring long enough to ensure that justice is served properly. Some battles are won not in the moment, but in the courtroom. The sophistication of her answer, and the casual reference to legal proceedings, struck several recruits as oddly professional for someone they believed to be a struggling civilian recruit. Foster, in particular, was beginning to piece together observations that didn't fit with Rebecca's supposed background. As the afternoon wore on, the investigation expanded to include personnel from other training companies and even recruits who had graduated from Camp Riverside in recent months. Investigators were clearly constructing a comprehensive timeline of abuse and corruption that extended far beyond the immediate incident that had triggered their involvement. The transformation in the base's atmosphere was remarkable. Where there had been fear and arbitrary authority, there was now professional military discipline. Where there had been secrecy and intimidation, there was now transparency and accountability. The very air seemed cleaner, as if a toxic cloud had been lifted from the entire facility. But Rebecca knew that the most significant revelations were still to come. Her true identity remained hidden, and when that information finally surfaced, it would provide the final piece of evidence needed to demonstrate just how completely the command structure at Camp Riverside had failed in its basic responsibilities. As evening approached and the investigation showed no signs of slowing down, Rebecca prepared herself for the moment when Lieutenant Colonel Torres would finally step out from behind the mask of Private Morgan, bringing with her the full weight of military justice and the promise that such systematic abuse would never again be allowed to flourish in the shadows of official procedure. The culmination of the investigation arrived with the thunder of rotor blades cutting through the desert air at precisely 0800 hours on Tuesday morning. The sound drew every person on Camp Riverside to their windows and doorways, watching as a convoy of military helicopters descended toward the base's landing pad with the coordinated precision of a major operation. Rebecca stood with the other recruits in formation, but her trained eye immediately recognized the significance of what was approaching. The lead helicopter bore the distinctive markings of high-level command transport, while the accompanying aircraft carried the unmistakable profile of security and communications support. This was not a routine inspection or administrative visit. This was the arrival of someone with the authority to reshape the entire military justice system. As the helicopters touched down, a steady stream of personnel emerged with the practiced efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. Military police in full-dress uniform formed ceremonial ranks, while intelligence officers and legal specialists moved with the focused intensity of people executing a plan that had been months in the making. But it was the figure who emerged from the command helicopter that sent shockwaves through every witness. General Patricia Hawthorne stepped onto the tarmac with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, her uniform displaying enough ribbons and decorations to humble even the most decorated veterans. As the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, she was one of the most powerful figures in the military hierarchy, and her personal presence at Camp Riverside meant that the events unfolding here had captured attention at the very highest levels of command. Behind General Hawthorne came a procession of senior officers whose combined authority could reshape military policy with a single decision. Colonel Stevens from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, Brigadier General Martinez from Military Personnel Command, and a team of specialists whose presence indicated that this investigation had implications far beyond a single training facility. The assembled recruits watched in awe as this display of military power organized itself with clockwork precision. None of them had ever seen such a concentration of high-ranking officers, and the magnitude of the response to their local situation was almost incomprehensible. "Holy shit," whispered Private Barnes, forgetting military protocol in his amazement. What the hell did Kruger do to bring down this kind of response? Rodriguez, standing next to Rebecca in the formation, noticed something that the others missed. While every other recruit was staring in open-mouthed amazement at the arriving dignitaries, Rebecca maintained the composed expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this development. "You don't seem surprised," Rodriguez observed quietly. Rebecca's smile was barely perceptible. Some things are inevitable once the right wheels start turning. Before Rodriguez could ask what she meant, the formation was called to attention as the command group approached the training area. General Hawthorne moved with the confidence of someone who owned every space she entered, her eyes scanning the assembled recruits with the practiced assessment of a leader who had seen every variety of military situation during her distinguished career. "Where is Major Park?" General Hawthorne's voice carried across the training ground without effort, commanding immediate response from everyone within hearing distance. Major Park emerged from the administrative building at a near run, snapping to attention with the rigid precision of someone confronting their ultimate superior. "General Hawthorne, Major Park reporting as ordered." "Status report, Major." "Ma'am, we have documented evidence of systematic abuse, financial corruption, and complete breakdown of command authority at this installation. 17 personnel are currently under investigation for various violations of military law, including assault, theft, conspiracy, and failure to report criminal activity." General Hawthorne's expression darkened as she absorbed the scope of the corruption. "And the recruit who was assaulted? Where is Private Morgan?" The question sent a ripple of tension through the formation, as every recruit suddenly realized that Rebecca was the specific focus of this unprecedented command attention. Major Park's eyes moved directly to Rebecca's position in the ranks. "Present and accounted for, General." "Step forward." Rebecca broke ranks and marched to a position directly in front of General Hawthorne, coming to attention with the kind of textbook precision that drew admiring glances from the assembled officers. As she stood there, the contrast between her careful recruit posture and the military bearing that occasionally leaked through her performance became more apparent to the observant witnesses. General Hawthorne studied Rebecca with the intensity of someone conducting a detailed inspection, taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of personal concern that surprised many of the watching recruits. "How are you holding up, soldier?" "Fine, ma'am. Just doing my job." The simplicity of Rebecca's response seemed to amuse General Hawthorne, whose smile suggested she understood layers of meaning that were invisible to the other witnesses. "Indeed you are, and doing it exceptionally well, I might add." General Hawthorne turned to address the assembled formation, her voice rising to carry clearly across the entire training ground. "I want everyone here to understand something about what happened at this facility. The systematic abuse and corruption that has been uncovered represents a complete failure of military leadership at multiple levels." She gestured toward Rebecca, who remained standing at attention beside her. This recruit was subjected to unauthorized punishment, including physical assault, because a sergeant chose to abuse his authority rather than follow proper military procedure. Such behavior is not only criminal, it is a betrayal of every principle that the United States Army represents. The general's words carried the weight of absolute moral authority, and several recruits who had previously remained silent about their own experiences began to understand that they had been victims of criminal behavior rather than legitimate military discipline. However, General Hawthorne continued, her tone shifting to something more ominous. "What Sergeant Kruger and his accomplices didn't realize is that they chose the wrong person to target for their abuse." The statement hung in the desert air like a gathering storm, pregnant with implications that none of the recruits fully understood, but which sent chills through everyone present. Rebecca remained motionless, but something in her bearing began to change, as if a carefully constructed mask was finally beginning to slip away. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawthorne announced with the formal gravity of someone delivering a verdict that would reshape everything, "allow me to introduce you to the real identity of the woman you know as Private Jessica Morgan." The moment of revelation had finally arrived, and with it, the complete transformation of everything the recruits thought they knew about their fellow trainee and the true scope of the investigation that had brought down their entire command structure. The silence that followed General Hawthorne's announcement stretched across the training ground like a held breath, every recruit frozen in anticipation of words that would fundamentally alter their understanding of everything they had witnessed over the past weeks. The desert wind had stilled, as if nature itself was waiting for the revelation that would transform their entire perception of reality. "The woman standing before you," General Hawthorne declared, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "is not Private Jessica Morgan. She is Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, one of the Army's most accomplished intelligence officers, currently assigned to my personal staff at the Pentagon." The effect was immediate and devastating. Gasps erupted from the formation as recruits struggled to process information that seemed to defy everything they thought they knew. Foster's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while Rodriguez took an involuntary step backward as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami of realization. Barnes, who had participated in holding Rebecca during the forced haircut, went pale as death as he understood that he had physically restrained a superior officer on the orders of a sergeant who had just committed one of the most serious crimes possible under military law. Wilson, who had been forced to find imaginary violations in her bunk, looked physically ill as he realized the true scope of what they had all witnessed. But it was Thompson, who had deliberately sabotaged Rebecca during training exercises, who provided the most dramatic reaction. His legs buckled, and he would have fallen if the recruit next to him hadn't caught his arm. The knowledge that he had intentionally hindered an officer who outranked nearly everyone on the base was clearly too much for his psychological equilibrium to handle. "Lieutenant Colonel Torres," General Hawthorne continued, "has been conducting an authorized undercover investigation into allegations of systematic abuse, corruption, and criminal activity at this installation. Her mission required her to assume the identity of a struggling recruit in order to document the true nature of the problems here." Rebecca remained at attention, but as General Hawthorne spoke, her entire bearing began to transform. The careful hesitation and uncertainty that had characterized Private Morgan melted away, replaced by the confident posture of a seasoned officer. Her shoulders straightened, her gaze sharpened, and suddenly every recruit could see the intelligence and authority that had been hidden beneath her carefully constructed persona. For 6 weeks, General Hawthorne explained, Lieutenant Colonel Torres endured systematic harassment, abuse, and ultimately physical assault, all while maintaining perfect operational security and gathering the evidence necessary to expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into multiple levels of this installation's command structure. Foster found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're really an officer?" Rebecca turned to face her former bunkmate, and when she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "I really am. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, Military Intelligence Corps. 12 years of active duty, with tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several classified assignments." The transformation was so complete that several recruits actually saluted before catching themselves. This was no longer the struggling woman they had come to know and protect. This was a superior officer whose authority exceeded that of everyone they had encountered during their training. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "All those times you seemed to know things about military procedure that you shouldn't have known. All those moments when you seemed too composed for someone who was supposedly overwhelmed by training." "I was playing a role," Rebecca acknowledged. "Every hesitation, every mistake, every moment of apparent confusion was carefully calculated to maintain my cover while I documented what was really happening here." Wilson stepped forward, his face still pale with shock. "When Kruger made me find fault with your bunk, when he forced us to participate in harassing you, you knew we were following orders from someone who had no authority over you?" Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Wilson, you and the others were victims too. Kruger used intimidation and the threat of punishment to make you complicit in his abuse. That's a classic technique used by corrupt authority figures. They spread the guilt around so that everyone becomes invested in maintaining the system." Barnes, who had been standing in stunned silence since the revelation, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, when Sergeant Kruger ordered us to hold you during, He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice breaking under the weight of what he now understood he had participated in. "Barnes," Rebecca said firmly, You were following what you believed to be lawful orders from a superior. Kruger exploited your respect for military hierarchy to make you participants in criminal activity. That's on him, not on you. General Hawthorne stepped forward again, her expression grave. However, let me be absolutely clear about the legal situation here. Sergeant Kruger and his accomplices committed assault against a superior officer, interference with an official investigation, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of military authority. These are federal crimes that carry severe penalties, including prison time and dishonorable discharge. The recruits listened in stunned silence as General Hawthorne outlined the scope of the criminal charges that would be filed. The magnitude of Kruger's error was almost incomprehensible. He had not only assaulted an officer, but had done so while that officer was conducting an authorized investigation into his own criminal behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Torres, General Hawthorne continued, your professionalism and dedication in maintaining your cover, despite extreme personal cost, reflects the highest traditions of military service. Your sacrifice has exposed a pattern of abuse that extends far beyond this single installation and will result in comprehensive reforms throughout our training system. Rebecca came to attention and saluted. Thank you, General. I was simply doing my job. Indeed you were, and doing it exceptionally well. General Hawthorne returned the salute, then addressed the recruits one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed something extraordinary. You have seen what happens when corruption meets true military professionalism. Remember this lesson. The uniform demands honor, integrity, and respect for every person who wears it, regardless of their rank or background. As the general and her entourage prepared to depart, Foster approached Rebecca with tears in her eyes. I can't believe we never figured it out. All those weeks we thought we were protecting you. Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. You were protecting me, Foster. Your friendship and support meant more than you know. And Wilson, Rodriguez, all of you. You showed courage and decency under impossible circumstances. That's what real soldiers do. As the helicopters prepared for departure, carrying with them the evidence that would reshape military justice, Rebecca looked back at the training ground where she had endured weeks of systematic abuse in service of a larger truth. The mission was complete, justice was being served, and Camp Riverside would never again be a place where corruption could flourish in the shadows. The transformation from victim to victor was complete, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed something that would be remembered and discussed throughout military circles for years to come. 6 months later, the transformation of Camp Riverside was so complete that it barely resembled the facility where Rebecca Torres had once endured systematic abuse under the blazing Nevada sun. The concrete buildings remained the same, the desert landscape still stretched endlessly toward the horizon, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered from a place of fear and arbitrary cruelty to one of professional military development and mutual respect. Rebecca stood at the edge of the parade ground where she had once been publicly humiliated, her hair now grown back into a neat regulation style that framed a face marked by quiet satisfaction. She wore her dress uniform bearing the silver oak leaves of a full colonel, a promotion that had come through in recognition of her exceptional service during the Camp Riverside investigation and its aftermath. The case had become a landmark in military justice, cited in training manuals and legal precedents as an example of how corruption could be systematically exposed and eliminated. The trials that had followed her revelation had been swift and decisive. Sergeant Kruger had been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to assault on a superior officer, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. His military pension had been forfeited, and he had received a dishonorable discharge that would follow him for the rest of his life. Master Sergeant Cole had received 4 years for his role in enabling and covering up the abuse, while Captain Walsh faced ongoing prosecution for financial crimes related to the misappropriation of recruit funds. But the most satisfying outcome for Rebecca had been the comprehensive reforms implemented throughout the training system. New oversight protocols, independent reporting mechanisms, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting abuse had been instituted at every basic training facility in the Army. The Torres protocols, as they had come to be known, ensured that what had happened at Camp Riverside could never be repeated. Today's visit was partly professional and partly personal. Rebecca had been asked to speak to the current class of recruits about leadership, integrity, and the courage to stand up against corruption. But she had also wanted to reconnect with the people who had shared her ordeal and see how their lives had developed in the months since that transformative day. Foster had surprised everyone by excelling in her military career after the trauma of basic training. She had been selected for officer candidate school and was now a second lieutenant assigned to military intelligence. Partly inspired, she admitted, by Rebecca's example of using intelligence gathering to fight injustice. Her confidence had blossomed once she was removed from the toxic environment that Kruger had created. "I never imagined I'd be giving briefings to Pentagon officials," Foster confided as they walked across the now peaceful training ground. "But watching you maintain your composure under impossible circumstances taught me that strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about being the most prepared and most patient." Rodriguez had chosen a different path, transferring to the military police and specializing in investigations of abuse and corruption within military ranks. His experience at Camp Riverside had given him unique insights into how good people could be coerced into participating in systems they knew were wrong, and he had become an expert in creating environments where victims felt safe reporting misconduct. "You taught us all something important," Rodriguez told Rebecca as they paused near the spot where Kruger had forced the humiliating haircut. "You showed us that real courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified of the consequences." Wilson had struggled more than the others with the psychological aftermath of his unwilling participation in Rebecca's abuse. He had spent months in counseling, working through the guilt and trauma of being manipulated into actions that violated his personal moral code. But he had emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of how authority could be corrupted and a fierce determination to never again allow fear to override his conscience. "I keep the journal I started during basic training," Wilson shared during their conversation. "Not because I want to remember the bad parts, but because I never want to forget how easy it is for good people to become complicit in evil when they're scared and isolated." Even Barnes and Thompson, who had been most directly involved in the physical aspects of Rebecca's abuse, had found ways to channel their remorse into positive action. Barnes had become an advocate for recruit rights, working with military legal services to ensure that trainees understood their protections under military law. Thompson had dedicated himself to mentoring younger soldiers, determined to create the kind of supportive environment that had been absent during his own traumatic basic training experience. The current drill instructors at Camp Riverside represented everything that Kruger and his accomplices had not. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the senior trainer, combined firm discipline with genuine respect for her recruits' dignity and potential. Her training methods were demanding but fair, designed to build character and competence rather than to break spirits through arbitrary cruelty. "The difference is remarkable," Santos told Rebecca during their meeting. "When recruits trust that their instructors are genuinely invested in their success, rather than looking for opportunities to humiliate them, their performance improves dramatically. We're turning out better soldiers because we're treating them like human beings." As Rebecca prepared to leave Camp Riverside for what might be the final time, she reflected on the complex legacy of her mission. The personal cost had been significant: the humiliation, the systematic abuse, the months of psychological recovery that had followed her return to normal duty. But the institutional changes that had resulted from her sacrifice were already protecting thousands of future soldiers from experiencing similar abuse. The most profound transformation, however, was in the recruits who had witnessed her ordeal and learned that some battles are won not through immediate retaliation, but through patience, documentation, and faith in the ultimate power of truth and justice. They had seen that real strength sometimes required accepting temporary defeat in service of a larger victory. As her staff car pulled away from Camp Riverside, Rebecca touched her hair, now fully grown back but still shorter than she preferred, and smiled at the irony that what Kruger had intended as the ultimate humiliation had become the catalyst for the most meaningful victory of her career. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not against foreign enemies, but against the corruption that could poison institutions from within. The desert sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the training ground where justice had ultimately prevailed, and where future generations of American soldiers would train in an environment defined by honor, respect, and the unwavering principle that every person in uniform deserved to be treated with dignity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.